And okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Before we start here, and I just want to give you a bit of a brief overview as to what we're doing today. And we actually obviously lost a day for the holiday on Monday, so we sort of a shortened week, but I think that's okay. I don't think it's going to be a big deal. What I like to do is sort of give a bit of an update as to what we're doing in the class. It should match pretty closely with what the syllabus is, and especially with the exam schedule, unless there's something really unusual, we will almost always run on track with that. But so today, this is the really our only class session for week 2. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk, today is 1:18, we're going to talk about some of the content that is sort of weaving in and out of chapters 1 and 2. But in particular, what I want to get to first is some of the content out of the Appendix A in your book. And I mentioned what that was last time. That was the, it's sort of a math piece. And I just want to sort of go over, maybe it's a math fresh start, refresher or jump start, or however you want to look at it. And I realize that people come to this class and a lot of classes that have any kind of involvement with math with all kinds of different backgrounds. I mean, I've had students who've had probably not as much math as I have, and it's a real snooze fest for 10 or 15 minutes or whatever. So bear with me if that is you, but if not, I think most of us can benefit at least from seeing what are the outer edges of the math requirements. That is, maybe it's important to know what's not going to be expected in terms of math. And I think you'll be, if you have anxiety in that regard, I know a lot of people have anxiety about math. It's just one of those things that maybe we'll sort of relax some of that a bit. Okay, so we're going to go to that today. That's really our only activity for this week. Well, I'll sort of get into some of the content from chapters 1 and 2. And I did post the information, the PowerPoint package. I think it's only 3 slides. There's not a lot. And so we're sort of wrapping up this sort of introductory section. Chapters 1 and 2 really are very introductory. And as I mentioned to the class, really at the outset of the course, that I'd be sort of weaving in and out of these chapters. And then it'd be very clear what chapter we're on as we get to chapter 3. That'll be next week. And so 123 is Monday. And we're going to get into chapter 3, okay? Unless we have some business we haven't picked up, we'll get into chapter 3. And then on the following day, or the following Wednesday, that is, we'll finish chapter 3. And then what I want to do is spend a little bit of time reviewing for the first exam, which is next week. And that'll be available in Brightspace. And I'll talk more about it. And when I say review, I'm just going to go over what some of the highlights are that you should be focusing on as you approach the exam. And I'll talk about some of the mechanics on the exam. What is the clock, right? It says 8:10. Or what does that say? I guess I'm a little late. I'm not that late. I don't think so. Okay. So we'll talk about some of the mechanics of the exam and what to expect. It's going to be in Brightspace. If you're not familiar with the Brightspace program, and I assume most of you probably are, but if not, no big deal. We'll walk you through that and show you how to access it. And you're going to be given a pretty good slice of time in order to do that. And it'll probably be available. My guess would be it'll be available sometime after class on Wednesday. And it'll be available the rest of that day, Wednesday, all day Thursday, all day Friday, all day Saturday, all day Sunday. So you've got quite a lot of time and opportunity to take it. And obviously we have makeup opportunities in the class, but really, particularly given the fact you can take it wherever, that probably is to your advantage just to take it rather than to lose 10% by doing a makeup. But if you have need, then that's fine, because things do happen. I realize that. Okay, so that's what we're doing today. Yeah, little screen short, or is that still moving around? Okay, that's fine. You can give it to me later. That's fine. So, and I'll probably have it up here every day, every class session in case people show up. By the way, you can show up here, or you can watch it live on Zoom. It's really up to you as to how you want to approach this. This is your choice, or you can watch the recorded Zoom session. I just remind everybody, if you don't show up in class or do, by the way, we record your attendance in Zoom because it downloads to a spreadsheet, so I have that. Assuming that you've put what is more or less approximately your name as you log in, as I think I mentioned, sometimes people put some weird nicknames, and I don't know who that is. So to record your attendance, if you're on the live Zoom feed, when you check into Zoom, just put your name, or even your first name is fine. I don't imagine we have too many duplicate first names as small as this class is. Okay, and then if you look at it sometime later in the week, just record your attendance to the discussion link. It says week 2 attendance link. It's under coursework. discussions, and it should be fairly straightforward. Don't write a book, just give me a sentence saying, I watched it. Okay, that's it. All right, and we just have to do it as it's just a process. It's just a mechanical thing we have to do. Okay. All right, so questions for me about anything before we get going? Okay, anything about what we're doing or whatever? Anybody on the Zoom link want to contribute anything? Of course, but if you do, that's fine. Also, you can type something in the chat link. As I move around the room, I'm probably not going to be able to see it right away, but I will get back to you, I promise, and all that. So anyway, that's the plan for the upcoming this week and next. And for whatever reason, I'm having a lot of trouble getting this camera to swivel. This thing is sort of stuck or whatever. So then sometimes I get it over to where I want it, and it sort of keeps on going. There we go. I think that's about as good as I'm gonna get. So, all right. Whoa, shoot. Whoa. What did I just do here? Well, I apologize. This thing is getting stuck, and I don't know why. It's almost like I want to get up there and move it manually, but I don't think I can. Shoot. It's getting stuck. Okay, that's moving. There we go. Stop. Okay. It's the battery on this darn thing. That could be what it is. Okay, zoom in. And I apologize for the technical glitches. This is not exactly a Hollywood production. If you need any kind of reminding on that. So, okay. The last thing we talked about last time was the circular flow model, and I went over that, and we talked about who the economic actors were, and we referred to them as actors. And remember, in this section of the class where we're dealing with the who, what, when, where, why of economics, just as an introductory sort of presentation, we said these are the who's that we'll be talking about: business firms, households, and governments. Do I need to go over any of that and just kind of recreate that? Because I think it's relatively straightforward. If you want to go back and look at the video I posted this week, or I posted it last week for the last class session. But remember, you've got two really sets of flows, and I think it's one useful way to think of an economy as being really two economies, and that is you've got a so-called real economy of goods and services and labor, and it's really kind of where we live. And everyone's aware of the fact that there's a money economy, but that's the economy that compensates for everything that we're doing. All the goods and services and labor that we're producing and exchanging in terms of value is reflected there. So there are really two economies. And when there's a big economic problem in the macroeconomy, I realize this is the micro class, but when there's a problem in the macroeconomy, it's usually some sort of disjointed situation. And we certainly saw that happen with the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And we saw it happen on the other side of the economy. That was with the financial economy, the money economy. We saw it happen with the shortages that we saw in the real economy in this pandemic. And we had a really brief recession as we sort of came out of that. So you get the idea that these things can get disjointed, which is why we need macro, which is why we need macro policy, which is why we need regulation, which is some of the things we're going to talk about. So what I want to do at the outset is to talk a little bit about Appendix A. I think I had this in the syllabus for last week, but I do want to cover some of it today, and just to make sure that we've got we're on the same page here as to what we're doing with the math expectations. And so you've probably seen this before, the sort of Cartesian coordinate plane where you've got the first quadrant, second quadrant, third quadrant, fourth quadrant, yada, yada. I think we're all familiar with this for the most part. And you've got some sort of ordered pair arrangement where if you have a plot point there, you can drag each down to its respective axis intercept. So the x-axis, the horizontal, the y-axis, the vertical axis. We're primarily going to be dealing with the first quadrant. That's the good news. So these last two quadrants are not particularly, or last three quadrants are not particularly critical. What is critical is this guy right here, the origin. And I know sometimes people get confused, and it's easy to get confused, and we don't help matters. Those of us who do this and write textbooks, when we say demand is increasing or supply is increasing or decreasing, and we tend to think of something as being up or down. And what I'm going to ask you to think about is, I wouldn't think so much as think about this axis here and think about where the origin is. And if you're confronted with an exam question or any kind of scenario where somebody's saying something is increasing or decreasing, think about going away from the origin as an increase. So to the right is an increase, and to the left is a decrease. Back toward the origin, back to zero, back to that zero value. I'm not saying the vertical axis is to be ignored. What I'm simply saying is if you've got some kind of curve or what, like this, for instance, and if it's increasing, it's going this way. It's a right versus rather than up down. The reason why is because yeah, an upward sloping curve looks like that. If it's decreasing, it's going to go like that. And it looks like it may be going up, but it's actually going to the left. It's decreasing. So be a little bit careful about that whole situation there. Got it? All righty. So if we've got this situation, we've got an XY coordinate plane, and you've got these coordinates correspond to some X1, Y1. Basically, what we're saying is we've got some sort of relationship between X and Y. What that is, it depends upon what it is we're trying to model, what it is that we're trying to demonstrate here. If we see this value change for whatever reason, then we've got some sort of new coordinate situation. We got some X2 and some sort of Y2, okay? And so we can denote that as X2, Y2. Well, okay, so why would this move? Well, these are a lot of what we do in economics is determine why variables move. Because if we know why they move, maybe we can do something about them. And I've long said about economics that there's no point whatsoever in studying economics we could do something about these things. It's like, what's the point of studying dentistry unless we want to solve dental problems? You know, it doesn't seem like there's any value at all. And the same goes with this. This should be a 3 here, shouldn't it? And so the idea is, what do we do about these changes in variables? Okay. Well, if we connect these in two-dimensional space, obviously, two values that connect with one another is a straight line, right? So when we're confronted with this linear sort of relationship, linear meaning straight line, we have a formulaic construction that is very basic, and y equals mx plus b. Excuse me. Okay, so y equals mx plus b. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but before we do that, I think it's really important that we sort of step back a minute and talk about what functions are generally. That is, what is a function that takes a very generic formula of y equals f of x? In other words, y is, in fact, if we just remove the symbols and just say, just put plain words into it, we say y is a function of x. What does that mean, y is a function of x? And I can tell you from, I guess from my experience at least, that I think one of the reasons why a lot of people have a bit of trouble with math, and I'll just give you my own experience, was that I think from the very beginning, we sort of, somewhere in grade school, we get off track by describing what a function is. And I remember in my class yesterday, somebody must have had a very similar sort of textbook that I had, but the function was described as this weird sort of machine that you dropped an X into and a Y popped out. And it was like there's some sort of black box that did something, who knows what, we don't know. It's doing something and out pops a different variable. And I thought, well, it's not really very helpful. It doesn't really explain very much. And instead, I think one way to look at it is a relationship that my daughter had a textbook when she was, I think, in junior high, grade school, junior high. And I thought explained it best. And I thought, gosh, this would be a lot easier had they been described like that. But it was the idea of in a function, if it's a functional relationship, that is, if y does what x directs it to do, then you have one unique value of y for one unique value of x. Meaning that any kind of a relationship like that would not be a function because you've got one unique x here, but an infinite number of y's. So that's not a function. And in fact, in mathematics, we say it fails the vertical line test. So instead, what we've got is one unique value of x and one unique value of y. And what her textbook said was, and I thought it was a really good analogy, it's very simple, but it was a good one. And that was, think of the high school prom where you've got one unique girl going one unique boy. And as a result, you've got, and it's not any other combination, not two girls, one boy, whatever, three girls, two boys, but it's one unique value of y with one unique value of x. And I realize that today, two girls can go to prom or two boys. I get that. I mean, that's not even, let's not get into that. Rather than just take the analogy for what it is, matching up different values with each other uniquely so that you form a relationship, okay? And so when we talk about this idea of a functional relationship, particularly when there's an issue of what we call dependency. And that is where one value depends upon another. We say that the y value tends to be the quote unquote dependent variable. Okay. The dependent variable. That is, the y value does what the x value, in other words, it sort of instructs it to do through this sort of box here that you throw the x into. But let's not even use that analogy because I think it's rather useless. And the x value is what's known as an independent variable. And the thing that we should know about the x value here, if there's a dependency relationship, and sometimes there's not, is that these are variables that are subject to control or management. These are things that are under our control, okay? If you take something like, well, you can even take a very basic labor function for an individual worker, maybe it's you, right? And the dependent variable is wages. And what are wages? Let's just say you're an hourly worker, right? What do wages? Y equals wages. What do wages depend upon? What's the big thing that drives wages? I'm talking about the rate of hourly pay, but what, say a weekly wage or an hourly or monthly wage, whatever, it depends on what? Hours, right? So if Y is the wage expressed in dollars, and it's not unusual to have variables that are in different denominations, dollars versus the X value, which is hours, which are measured quantitatively in numbers. And that's not an unusual scenario at all. In fact, we're going to be looking at a lot of instances in which we've got a dollar value that we plot on the vertical axis and a numerical value on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, okay? So if you work more hours, you get more pay, right? It's a variable that's subject to control. Now, it may not be subject to a worker's control, maybe it's subject to the employer's control, but it's something that's subject to control. It's something that can be changed, can be raised, can be lowered, and whatever, okay? So if you work more hours, you tend to earn more wages, and that's tend to work fewer hours, you tend to get less wages. That simply is the relationship. And so think about this too. I guess one other way of looking at this issue of dependency is by thinking about the Y values being a scoreboard and the X values being sort of the player on the field, okay? So now football playoff season is upon us, and so there's football everywhere. And so if you think about this, if Y is the scoreboard and X are the player, and by the way, you can have multiple X's that could be infinite. Just infinite. I mean, I've seen some pretty nasty equations that you probably don't want to see, but you can have lots and lots of X values. And so if an X player goes and scores a touchdown, the Y value goes up by 6 points, right? But it's not the other way around. The scoreboard operator doesn't say, hey, it's time for a touchdown, let's put 6 points on the board, and then the players go score a touchdown. That obviously is an absurd example, which we all know. And I know the example is absurd, but it's an obvious one that sort of tells us what is the direction of the relationship. So in economics, we deal a lot with this issue of dependency, particularly when it comes, this is not an unusual situation at all that we'll be dealing with here, this idea of wages and hours, or wages and productivity. That is, sometimes more productive workers get more working hours and hence earn higher wages, all that kind of thing. Okay, so if we go back to our linear function here, I'm sorry I've only got one board to work with, but I'm sort of mindful of the video feed that we're trying to work with. I'm just going to go ahead and erase these other three axes here because frankly we don't really use them. We're going to be dealing with positive values against positive values in terms of plotting points and functions and whatnot. But we'll have negative values obviously going on. But if we take this linear function, something has changed from point A to point B. So point A is x1, y1, and point B is x2, y2. Something has changed and we don't know what, okay? So if you tear into this equation, we know what the y is, we know what the x is. We know the b is, if you remember your algebra, it's the intercept of where, on the vertical intercept where it crosses, if it does cross. But the most important value in this, for our purposes, often is this guy here, which is what? The slope. The slope, and it's the slope of the linear function. Those of you who had calculus before, you could take the slope of a curve, but you need calculus to do it. We're not going to be using that. So if you are concerned that maybe you haven't had calculus, don't be concerned. And I know that sometimes a lot of instructors think it's easier to teach econ with calculus, but I don't know that that's inherently a difficult problem because we're going to stick to algebra. That's sufficient for our purposes. And so what does slope do? Well, first of all, it's expressed just in the words as rise over run, which I think you've seen before. Okay, and that is the change in the vertical over the change in the horizontal. Okay, this should be familiar, old hat to you, I would imagine, right? Well, in mathematical terms, in algebraic terms, we would refer to it as the change in the vertical, which is the y, and the Greek delta symbol, little triangle, always means change pretty much everywhere you see it in any discipline that uses for the change in the horizontal, which is the delta x. So delta y over delta x. It's the change in the y over the change in the x, and that's what gives us a value called slope. But what is slope trying to tell us other than just, well, it's just a math problem that I've got to solve? It's telling us what is the rate of change in one variable in relation to change in another. That's really what the critical issue here is. With slope, it's telling us the rate of change in one variable. Okay, rate of change in one variable in relation to change in another variable. And it's this issue of relationships that really is important in relation to another variable. And I think one of the things that is very important to realize is that economics really began becoming relevant once we started getting into the mathematics to show mathematically to the world, because mathematics is really intended, isn't it, to be objective and observable and measurable. And if I can measure something, I can present it equation or set of equations or a set of proofs. And we can all say, okay, well, that makes sense. Other than see me simply saying, I think what's happening is that, wages are falling because workers don't want to work or something like that, right? That's just somebody sitting on a bar stool somewhere, spouting off, right? I mean, that's not very rigorous. It doesn't, an economist probably wouldn't say that unless maybe he's the guy on the bar stool. I don't know, but you get the idea. It's not very rigorous, but yet we hear this in everyday speech. People don't want to work and all that. And by the way, this is not a new thing. I've been hearing this my whole life, and I think I've probably been around longer than anyone here. And that's a very unrigorous sort of analysis. Instead, wages might be falling because employers are laying people off. We're starting to see layoffs happening in the economy, and it's by design, and it's our government doing it intentionally because they're trying to sort of pop this inflation bubble that's bubbling up and threatening to get out of control. And so they're slowing the economy down, and it's taking a while to do. The labor market is still pretty strong, and I think probably a lot of you understand that. I mean, jobs don't appear to be too hard to find, really. And wages, and even starting wages, are pretty good. So I've been telling people for a long time, if you're looking for a job, you might want to get that locked down pretty soon, because I think it's going to change. We're starting to see big layoffs from big employers. I think Microsoft is like about 10,000 people, Amazon something like 10 or 11,000, and they plan to lay off more. And some of that may be seasonal because of the holiday season being over, but there are big employers. Facebook, I think, also did the same thing. And those are just the ones that we've heard about. But that will sort of work its way through the economy. I hate to use the term trickle down, but it might make sense. And so you get the idea. That is maybe an explanation for why some wages are falling. And labor is often what we call a lagging indicator. It's often the very last thing that tells us where we are in the stage of a business cycle. Okay, but back to this. If we got change in Y, change in X, what does this really mean? All it simply means is it's always new minus old, new minus old. And I'll preach that throughout the class. So it's xy2, which is the new value, minus y1 minus x2 over x1. So let's just say here that we wanted to, I don't know, randomly put numbers in here. Say x1 is 5 and x2 is 9. Let's just keep this sort of realistic here. And y1 and y2. y1 is 7 and y2 is 11. Okay. Well, now let's just plug in the values and see what we've got here. So y2 minus y1 is 11 minus 7. x2 minus x1 is 9 minus 5. We get 4 over 4, right? I didn't plan that, but it's 1. So that's probably about what I've got. Something that's 45 degrees up is probably like that. And sort of running out of ink here. What is missing here is understood, obviously, and that's the plus sign. If it were negative, and if it were sloped like that, then it would be different. We'd have a negative value here. And that's an important thing for us to think about. It's going to come up again really beginning on Monday when we get into chapter 3, and that is this, and it's really the final piece, and then I'll sort of leave this math discussion behind us, which may be something you're thankful for. But if there's a positive slope, right, and the slopes here are just going to be on linear functions, right? If there's a positive slope, we're saying there's what we call a direct relationship between x and y, or what substitutes for x and y, whatever it is, x and y, or whether it's hours or wages or whatever, right? A direct relationship between x and y. Okay. In other words, what this means is if x goes up, so does y. And if x goes down, so does y. Okay, if there's a positive slope. And if there's a negative slope, if that value that we compute here, what's called the point slope formula, then we have what's called an inverse relationship between x and y. And that simply means, I hope this comes through on the video here, if x goes, oops, if x goes up, the same logic here. If x goes up, y goes down. And if x goes down, y goes up. Okay, and this is an important thing to be aware of. And we're going to see this a lot. In other words, if it's a positively sloped function, I mean, if it goes up, it's a positive slope. If it goes down, it's a negative slope. Even if it's a curve like this, we might take the slope of a function at any particular point is the slope of that tangent line, right? That's a way to get out of having to use calculus. And as a result, if it's downward sloping, it's going to have a negative value for slope, meaning there's an inverse relationship between whatever the two values are that are plotted on that first quadrant in this graph, right? And we're going to use lots of graphs to illustrate what's going on in economics, okay? So we know that's what's happening. Meaning if one thing goes up, the other thing goes down, that sort of thing. So we're going to be there a lot. Now, why do we use graphs? Well, think about this. There are different ways that we can illustrate economic events to you. And the very earliest economists basically just wrote tracts of work, long papers, long books sometimes, just explaining how the economy worked. And if you have some of the very earliest work thinkers like Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, they weren't particularly quantitatively inclined. And then as the 18th or the 19th century, as the early 1800s opened, then economists started to get a little bit more mathematical. So not just words, but now numbers. So words is one way to do it. Numbers is another. And so we got into the work of David Ricardo and Alfred Marshall. We got into this issue of using calculations, which got very much more rigorous. And as the 1800s sort of came to an end, we got Marshall and Pigot and others were developing graphical models to help people see things. And really, we all learn differently. We're all sort of wired a little bit differently. And some of us learn better by reading text. Some of us learn better by looking at numbers. Some of us do better by looking at pictures. And so there are really three ways that we can try to explain these phenomena. And I realize that sometimes people don't like the graphs very much. And the only thing I can tell you is it's a useful way for us to express economic relationships. And it helps us to understand what's going on. Because I think that one of the things that I think is sort of a scandal within our society generally, I'm not attacking any one segment of society, but it's the fact that a lot of people just simply don't understand what's going on in economics a lot of times. And what really drives us as economists just absolutely up the wall is when we hear on a press story where they just got it completely wrong and they just totally misunderstood what the economic data is showing. And I think that they understand that limitation at the national level, and so they'll bring on an expert to explain things. But at the local level, sometimes they'll just make them, it'll be a mosh pit. It'll just be awful. And they just don't have it down as to what's going on. And that's unfortunate because, you know, highly educated people ought to be able to understand these basic relationships of where we live our lives and why econ is important. And I mentioned this, I think, last week, and that is we're all economic actors. We're all economic beings. Unless we live off the grid totally, and that's not very many of us, we're all on there. We're all, you know, doing things and making a contribution, and we're making an impact, and it's impacting us. And so we're sort of along for the ride when it comes to a lot of these events. Okay, so that's my discussion on sort of the math bit of this. Are there questions for me about anything I've talked about here? And if you do have questions, feel free to let me know. And hopefully that wasn't too onerous for you. And I cannot figure out why. I'm going to have to see whether or not we've got a problem with this. This is like the second day we've had trouble with this. I can't get this thing to focus. For those of you who are watching the Zoom link, the camera's zoomed like really focused in a lot on the screen there. Now I hit the button. Now we're too far out. And there we go. I'm going to call this in. Stop. Oh man, this is bad. Okay, well, I'm going to probably put while I'm ahead here. Okay, well, let's move on to talking about some of I want to get into some, because I think I got through everything I wanted to get through last time with regard to the material in chapter in the first set of, let me just look here real fast. I think we got through everything last time. And I want to focus now on this idea of hows and all of that of economics. And so let me just make sure. So I went through, talked about the actors. Yeah, that was where we ended. Okay, all right. Okay. That's where we want to be. All right, so let's talk a bit about, I'm going to try to get this a little bit tighter for those of you who are watching the Zoom link. If I can, stop. There we go. Okay, that's about as good as it's going to get. Okay, I want to talk a bit about factors of production, okay? And what they are. And what I'm doing here is I'm just sort of covering some of the basics here, I think. Is that too dark? Is that too dark? Okay. I'm just covering some of the basics of, again, the who, what, when, where, why. And some of this is important because this describes some of the whats that are employed in economics. And so think about this, okay? We give the circular flow model, which we define a model as being sort of a graphic illustration, a representation, could be a simulation of what's going on. And that's what model building does. But we also need to find out who's doing what and what they're using in order to produce value. Probably the most basic economic model we can even think of is that of inputs and outputs. Think about inputs as being all these things out here. And somebody's doing some value creation in here. That's the everyday work that we do. And then out the other end come these outputs that we exchange to others. Even if it's something like a raw material, like all the work of farmers, for instance, all they're doing is they're producing raw materials for what? For food companies, for seed companies, for all, they may produce wool if they have sheep and whatnot. All these outputs to them become inputs to somebody else. And it goes on and on through the chain of value, right? You drill for oil, the oil is an output, and then you give somebody else who, a trucking company uses an input in their process. So inputs are these things that are corralled into the production process and out come outputs. But they're all employing inputs that we call input factors that we've categorized in four main categories. And these are very old categories, at least the first three: land, labor, capital. These go back really in the 1700s, where the very earliest people who were just writing about economics were talking about these, and they were mostly right. And then at some point, we came up with a fourth category known as entrepreneurial ability. And that's sort of an X factor. And I think that probably appeared on the scene about 30 years ago or so. And I suspect one of the reasons why is because economists, I think, were probably greatly influenced at the time by, I don't know, business schools and whatnot, who said, look, what you're missing here is these are all things you can sort of see and touch and move around and all that, but what you're missing is this sort of ingenuity and this sort of X factor that is not reflected. And that's what entrepreneurial ability really is this sort of X factor that people bring to the table. That it's not just labor, number two. In fact, there was some pushback, I guess, about entrepreneurial ability, because people were saying, look, we've got people here, and so why are we including this? And so I guess it's a fair argument, but nonetheless, it exists as a separate category. And again, you can read about this in the online text if you like. But let's talk about the first one here, land. And again, these are really old school terms. When we talk about land today, we're not talking about land, necessarily land as land, but when we talk about land here, we're talking about natural resources. And that is those things which come to us by virtue of our coincidentally being on the same planet as these things, right? So land as natural resources. And I think what I may do is try to swivel the camera over here a bit. I realize I'm taking a big chance here with doing that, but I'm making some, hopefully everyone's got land, labor, capital, entrepreneurial ability, all that. Oh, let's see, wrong way. And so I want to talk about land as land and labor and what that really is here. So what about natural resources? What are some of the things that we use so that we can corral, we can get our arms around and employ in the production of output so we can exchange with others? So examples are what? What kind of natural resources?
Water.
Water, okay. Water's a good one. We use that. Everyone uses water. It's important, and certainly in this part of the country, there's no shortage of us worry about water. Huh?
Silica sand.
Silica sand. Okay.
Well, that's actually one of the biggest resources used, on the planet.
To make glass.
Yeah.
And what?
Not just glass, but almost
Plastics.
everything we make, plastics,
Yeah, okay.
almost everything we have.
Okay.
We
Yeah,
have
no,
to
you're
use
right.
sand.
Yeah,
to
no,
make
you're
it.
right. You're right. And in fact, I'm going to sort of just to sort of make it take a little shortcut here. I'm just going to say this because that's really what we're talking about here is all of these things which are there by virtue of our being on the same planet. So oil and copper and silicon, as you said, but all these chemicals and things that have a chemical compound which come to us by being our virtue of our being on the planet. Now we have to corral it. We got to get it, and we got to control it. In fact, there's a lot of debate and lawsuits and conflict, frankly, even between countries over raw materials like these kinds of things here, has been for centuries. And so it is a source of conflict. And again, I mentioned in the class last time that conflict doesn't come up again and again and again in economics. It just is a fact of life. So minerals. Okay, what else? What else come to us by our virtue of being on the same planet? All of which falls under land, which, by the way, doesn't even have to be on the land itself. Because it can include wind, right? And in fact, I don't think we probably would have included wind and solar as inputs, maybe 30 years ago or so. It's kind of a bigger source of input. And whether it will replace the burning of fossil fuels, particularly to power power plants, I don't know. I mean, I know P&M, our electricity provider, is sort of ratcheting up their use of particularly wind and solar, and we're in the right part of the country to get lots of wind and solar. Maybe to the point where they can sell it to other parts of the country, which don't quite have as much of that in abundance. But that's certainly, those are inputs, and then the output to them is electricity. So that's their output. And then we, as consumers, use that as an input. Well, more importantly, producers will use electricity as an input into what they do. If you go to the office, right, we're using an input of electricity. That's why I'm pressing switches here, right? So that's the input, and the output that we're producing here is credit hours, I guess, is what we would say. So wind, solar, what else? How about things like timber, which is not really minerals, so it's more vegetable. So timber becomes lumber, and lumber becomes houses, right? Or timber becomes paper, and paper becomes whatever, paperwork, I guess. So timber comes to us by virtue of our being on the same planet, and long-running debate about, are we deforesting too much in the world in general, and that's a big question. There's lots of discussion. If those of you who are really interested in the environmental impact of economics, we do have a course in environmental economics in UNM. For those of you who are really interested, UNM really specializes in environmental economics. Really, the econ department there is one of the best at economic effects. When we say environmental economics, it's not all about climate change. It's more about natural resource management. Things like water management, all that kind of thing. So, things like invasive species and things like that. So wind, solar, timber. Also, and anthropologists would like this, there's a time in which humans were able to sort of control the animal kingdom and call a certain subset, a very small subset of the animal kingdom, livestock, right? And it is a small subset because most of the animal kingdom is not under human control at all and resists human control. There are certain species that we've got no use for economically. And I know there's a lot of issues about, whether we're treating livestock humanely and whatnot. That's a pretty good argument. I mean, I come from a farming and ranching family, and I'm not sure that my grandfather was always as humane to his horses and cattle who were freezing. What do you do? I don't know. But so I get that. Believe me, I'm very sensitive to that. At some point, we took some part of the animal kingdom and created livestock. And then we created some part of the vegetable world, a subset, small subset, and created growing crops that we could manage. And anthropologists will sort of point to these events, which didn't happen like a light switch, but it was an evolutionary process by which humans really began to get control over the resources to a greater extent than before. So if you think back about the basics that we need for human existence, food, clothing, and shelter, a lot of this goes into providing that. So these are land as natural resources. Is there anything else that I may be missing here that is relevant to this that we should talk about in terms of natural resources? Okay, well, what about the second category? So we got labor, all right? Now this may seem completely obvious as to what we're talking about when we talk about labor. And in fact, the early economists of the 18th century talked about labor a lot and about how workers were productive or unproductive, and that their wage would be really dependent upon the productivity of labor, and that they'd be aided with machinery and whatnot. And obviously the conflict, if there is a conflict between labor and machines, is a long-standing one that still exists to some extent today. But we're going to take the definition of labor and sort of expand it to modernize it and bring it up to date. That is, we're going to refer to labor in general as human capital. Human capital. And these are things that people bring to the labor market. In the circular flow model, when I told you that I like to sort of present a sort of simplified circular flow model, more simplified than what's in your textbook. And one of those sort of intermediate categories between households and firms, where households are providing output, that's their labor. It goes through a competitive labor market where we compete for jobs and we're compensated based upon the relative wages of others in similar capacities in other firms. And firms do pay attention to what other firms are paying, particularly if workers are leaving. Believe me, they pay attention to it. I remember very clearly where I was working in banking at the time, and our wages for our hourly workers were not keeping up. People were just leaving us in droves. And so finally we had to give, reluctantly, very grudgingly, they give everybody a wage increase. They didn't do it because they were nice people. Well, they were pretty nice people, but they did it because they had to, because they had to sort of stop the exit of people heading for the door. So human capital are these things that people bring to that competitive labor market. Now, before we go forward here, I want to address a seeming bit of confusion here, and that is number 3 on this category is capital, but yet we've got human capital. So what on earth are we talking about here when we talk about capital? Well, first of all, let's define the term capital, and let's just, for once and for all, put this to bed so that we know that we've addressed what it is, because the word capital is probably the most overused and yet underdefined term everywhere in economics and finance. If you are looking from an accounting perspective in business, you'd say it's the difference between assets and liabilities. For those of you who've had accounting before, that's a pretty easy equation. It's called the basic accounting equation. If you say, hey, I've got a house that's worth $500,000, that's my capital I'm going to be using for my kids' education, and I'll sell my house when that's time. And that could be the definition of capital. Or it could be, I've got a business, and I've got $1 million worth of equipment out there in plant. You could say that's my capital. All those are correct definitions. So when we talk about human capital, what are we really talking about? Well, let's first give one definition of capital that will solve all problems here. And capital is anything which we built upon to produce future value. And I'm being very deliberately vague when I say anything which can be built upon to produce future value. Okay, so this is my last football analogy today, I think, to produce future value. So if in the football realm, if a team fumbles, the other team gets it, and they can't do anything with it, the announcer will invariably say they failed to starts with C. Anybody's, they fail to capitalize, right? They fail to build upon future value. You guys are shy here, right? So capital is anything which we built, anything which we built upon to produce future value. Okay. So in what are we talking about here? So remember the 3 examples I gave you, whether it's a business, there's an excess of the value of assets over liability, minus liabilities, that would be used as capital to produce future value in the future. When a business talks about taking some of its earnings and plowing it back into the business, it's called capitalizing earnings. That is putting it back in the business rather than, taking it all out and giving it out to owners. Some businesses do that. Some businesses don't have to do that. Business that I operate, we don't have to capitalize a lot of our earnings because we don't have a lot of assets. We have no debt. We don't have to support anything. It's just us who own the business. And that's really it. But some do. And if you've got lots of assets to support, lots of debt, then you may want to do that. The other example is if somebody's got a $500,000 house, maybe they sell it, and then they use that to produce future value, which is to pay for higher education down the road or whatever. Or if a business has got equipment, it's got equipment because it uses it to produce value. Okay, so that's the catch-all definition. Okay, let's circle back to what are we talking about in the first place? Human capital, which is a term that has not been around a long time. In fact, it was not used in the very early discussions of what economic life was about. Human capital is basically this. It is the things which we bring to the labor force that gives labor its value, which is why people are willing to pay us for our labor. And I don't mean just showing up and working 8 hours and going home, right? I suppose there are jobs that if you can get that kind of a job, that's great, right? But you're really expected to do something usually. And so as a result, and you're expected in a lot of cases to bring some things. And so what are you expected to bring to the labor force, particularly if you promised in the job interviews that you bring? What do you bring to the table beyond just you showing up for work or punching in, right? Education, okay, education's good. You bring education, and education it's one of the ones that would be on my list, and it's interesting. I'm kind of running out of black ink here. I don't know if that's coming through or not on the video. And I'm always kind of mindful of that because sometimes I look back on these videos and I think, it didn't really come through. So education is one of those. And when we think about education, we're thinking about something broad-based, really. And it is a situation where particularly higher, and I think we're talking about higher education, like what you all are doing here and now, right? So why does that have value? Particularly given the fact that sometimes people don't see it, particularly those, by the way, anybody who's never been to college before and looks at this as a waste of time will always refer to a college degree as invariably they'll always refer to a degree as a piece of paper and whatnot. And I can tell you, as somebody who's gotten these pieces of paper, nobody who's gotten them thinks of it in those terms, right? In fact, I think of it just quite the opposite. In fact, I had never heard anybody say, God, I can't believe I wasted all that time going to college. I'm not saying nobody's ever said it, but it's something you value. It's something you will take with you if you get a degree. And even if you don't get a degree, there is a definite correlation the Department of Education has tracked as years of college education versus lifetime earnings. Even if you don't get the degree, it does every year of that translates to higher lifetime earnings. Why is that, do you think? Even if it's the fact that colleges like us make you take classes that maybe you don't really want to take. English, I did not want to take English. I do not like English at all. I'm married to an English major, which makes it even more problematic because I can't get around talking about this. So we have to take English, we have to take history and literature, okay? But it's to make us sort of more broadly rounded and whatnot. Now let's go back to the degree thing. What does this, and I'm going to talk about this in the context of something in economics that we'll come back to a bit later, and it's something known as signals. And there are all kinds of signals that are given off by various activities. If you go to the doctor, right, and the doctor walks in wearing a tank top and cut off shorts and flip flops, they say, "Okay, how you doing? I'm Dr. So-and-so. Let's take a look." It's like, don't touch me. It's like you're not. Who are you, right? The doctor was wearing a white lab coat, has got a stethoscope. Okay, well, that must be a doctor, right? Am I right? If somebody walks off the street, it's like, who is this person? Right? So it's a signal. Likewise, if you go to a lawyer, I used to have a client who was a lawyer when I was in banking, and his office was just a mess. I mean, there were like Coke cans everywhere, and it smelled like popcorn. They were popping popcorn all the time, and it just didn't seem like a very professional operation. On the other hand, because and lawyers will go to great lengths right out of law school to do what? Make sure they've got a nice desk and a leather chair, big, huge leather chair, always. It's like required. It's like they must learn it in law school. You got to have big leather and books that they'll never, maybe even not even look at. It's part of the signal. They're telling you what? I'm a lawyer, and therefore, I know what I'm doing, right? Am I right? Signal. Okay, so back to this. What does a college degree signal to an employer? It tells them what? You have a BA from University of New Mexico. It tells them what? or BS or whatever. It's a credential, that's good, but it also tells them one thing that is specific to this issue of the labor market. It tells them about you that you can do what? Finish. You can finish, right? You can start and finish. A lot of people talk the talk, right? But it's walking the walk, that's the big thing, right? And that's what employers look at, is that you can finish and you can get through it and start it. Because we don't make it easy, and I know we don't. And believe me, I went to college for 10 years. And, you know, through 3 different degree programs, we don't make it easy. It's difficult. But it also signals that, you know, you've got the chops to do this. If you can handle doing this, you can probably handle what we're doing here. And even if your degree is in something else, oftentimes you are adaptable and you can learn and you've got the ability. So it sort of differentiates people. You can about a third of the population has degrees and the other third, 2/3 do not. And it's this higher third that frankly is honestly is pulling away from the rest of the population in terms of income. It really is. So bottom line, be happy where you are. You're probably in the right place. And a lot of you will go on to finish and do other things. And that's good. So that's one of them. Education is one of the things that we bring to the labor force. What else do people bring to the labor force that adds value? The more of it you got, the more you likely are going to be compensated. What's that? Experience. Excellent. That's also on my list of things. So what is it about experience? Now, by the way, this is important, and it's almost always a prerequisite for certain jobs that are anything above entry level. Obviously, entry level jobs, which most of us have had. I certainly have had my share of entry level jobs because when I first entered the labor force at age 16, I didn't know how to do anything at all. And I think we were paid. I was paid a whopping $3.35, which was the minimum wage back then, which was it's been a while ago, right? And I remember my boss at the time telling me that I probably wasn't even worth that, but he had to pay it. So it's like, okay, so real good, welcome to the job. I'll go get to work, right? You know, so you get the idea. So I didn't have experience, and so I didn't know how to do anything, right? So one thing about experience that's interesting is that it can't be, and I'm gonna throw one thing on here, one additional one, that's training, because I want to sort of differentiate education versus training. And that is this: it can't be taught in a book or in a degree program, and you really can't train somebody around it. You can do a little bit. And education refers to a more broad-based sort of background in things like sociology and whatnot. This is why we throw at you all these different cores, humanities core, science core, all that. And training is more job specific, but experiences, you either got it or you don't, and that's it. You either have it or you don't have it. And so you bring a lifetime or a career of experience to whatever you're doing. And I know my father had a construction company before he retired, and he always really insisted on knowing what people could actually do. And he would check this out about what kind of tools they had. And the construction, it's one of the unique industries where you kind of bring your own equipment to the job, and depends on what you've got. And does it look like you've been using that table saw? Does it look like you've been using that circular saw? What can you do, right? Other than just talk. And so experience is an important one. My mother was an attorney for a lot of years, and she focused mostly on this really weird corner of estate and probate law, and mostly for farmers who've got sort of complex issues anyway. Inheriting farms is complicated because sometimes heirs want to chop it up and whatnot, sell off a part to a developer or whatever. You get the idea. So when she retired, she would always get calls from her former firm saying, "Hey, we got this thing, and how do I argue this? When do we file this? What do we do?" It's just that you can't find the information out. You've got to learn it through experience. What's the best court to file this in? You know, that's what I think. It's experience. Okay, so education experience, education more broad-based, training more job specific and whatnot. So all these are important. Okay, so education experience, training, I guess maybe skills. Maybe this is sort of redundant in some cases here. Skills, that is job specific kinds of things. Are you able to do certain things? I had illusions at one time throughout high school and halfway through college where I might play professional baseball. And I had some skills, but I didn't have probably enough skills. And I sort of realized this is probably not going to happen. It's not going to happen. I wanted it to happen, but you got to be realistic about what your limitations are. You can play a ball, but that might be about it. So you got to have skills to do certain things, and sometimes they're gifted, and sometimes you just don't have it, and And that is, so you can certainly train somebody on skills, but sometimes people just don't see things the way others do and just don't handle situations the same way. So that is that. So I would not be a very good English instructor, for instance. And I'm not criticizing English. I've obviously English people in my family, but or English majors in my family, but that's neither here nor there. But I don't really have the skill set. Okay, capital. Well, this is one that kind of we circle back now to this idea of capital. Remember, land, labor, capital are pretty old school terms. They go back to the beginning of the time in which people first began thinking about economics, around the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so what did people mean by capital? Well, they meant something very specific at the time, and that was physical assets to be used in production. So this is a business firm concept, physical assets to be used in construction, or used in production, I'm sorry, used in production. So production of other goods. So in other words, goods used as other goods. Goods used as inputs, because we're talking about input factors that are sort of categorized in these three categories that are to be used in production to produce outputs. Okay, now, even the term physical is sort of outdated, isn't it? Because just like the term physical flow in the circular flow model, where a lot of our outputs aren't physical, a lot of our inputs aren't physical. So maybe it's not quite the best term, but it was the original term. For the most part, I think it still is, is useful. But some examples of this that are used in production, so it's primarily a business firm concept, whereas this is a human concept. And that is things like machinery and equipment, certainly, which is used in practically every business, even a service business will at least have a computer and maybe a point of sale machine and maybe a desk, hopefully something minimal like that. Machinery and equipment are close, I think, in alignment. I think the difference between the two is the machinery tends to have moving parts and equipment tends not to. If I'm right about that, maybe I'm not. But these are things that are used in the production of other goods. And so what we can say is also that today, even though, I'll give you another term that's sort of way overused maybe, and is very difficult to sort of put our arms around, that's technology, the employment of technology in general, which I think in today's context, we tend to think of as being some computer related, and it often is, frankly, computers are everywhere, and it's not going to change. And as we employ more computers, we just only get more productive and whatnot. But when we talk about computer technology, we're also talking about one thing which definitely does not have a physical characteristic, and that is software, which does not have a physical characteristic. Even though you may get a disk in UPS from Amazon or whatever, some software program, it's not, you're not paying for the piece of plastic, you're paying for the software, the intellectual property, which again, but let's sort of go with the idea, it's definitely used to produce other sorts of value, and so it's important. Also things like communications technology, which is all around us as we become more and more interconnected all the time. And, this extends really on sort of a worldwide context. I just read an article the other day about the US Navy used to periodically have places in the ocean where they were just out of touch with everybody. They would go maybe a few hours or a day. Nobody could reach a ship because they were in some place they couldn't be reached, or a submarine because they couldn't necessarily be found for a bit. I mean, they weren't lost forever. Today, that's really unlikely. It has been for a while because of satellite technology and all that. So another example of communications technology linking us together. So this definition again goes back to the 18th century, the late 1700s, of land, labor, and capital, meaning very specific things in terms in capital is mostly physical stuff, machines really, to be used to make other goods. Okay. And today, I think we can still say that that's still the definition, even though the world of technology has changed. And by the way, the economics really began as an economic discipline, or as an academic discipline, around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And the story of the Industrial Revolution really is the story of technology. It really is. I mean, in my mind, as a social scientist, I say that the Industrial Revolution, which began sometime in the 1700s in Europe and then began to sort of move around worldwide, as today worldwide is still ongoing, arguably, was probably the most radical thing to happen to humanity ever because population soared exponentially, food production soared, transportation soared, movement of goods and services, life expectancy rose, all these kinds of things. And this is all really a reaction or the result of adoption of technology of production systems. Okay, one final category. We've got about 5 minutes, and let's wrap this up. Entrepreneurial ability. So what is entrepreneurial ability? Well, first of all, we think of entrepreneurs, right? We oftentimes think about individuals like Steve Jobs or Henry Ford or whomever, right? I guess maybe Elon Musk. So even though Elon Musk has gotten lots of mixed press lately, mostly self-inflicted bad press, frankly. That's just my opinion. Please don't write that down, but it's not a professorial opinion, it just
It's already
is.
recorded.
Huh?
It's already recorded.
It's what?
It's recorded. Right?
Yeah, oh, it is. Oh, okay. Well, all right, I'm on tape. All right, well, that's fine. That's okay. Well, in that case, I mean, you know, I think it's probably going to be, we're going to be studying that as a business case study. He's taken over Twitter for years to come. It's just going to be this, you know, business school case study. But anyway, what about entrepreneurability? We think of entrepreneurs as individuals, and yet what is entrepreneurability? What is this X factor that sort of worked its way into these original three to be a fourth production factor that is now so critical to our understanding of the what's that are used in production? Well, I'll give you one definition here that is basically this, and we're going to come back later in the class, this micro course, to elaborate on this, and I hope this is not too small for anybody to see, either on the screen or in here. It's the ability and willingness to assume risk. And we're primarily talking about business risk. I'm sorry that's so small, and this marker is, let's just put that one to bed. That is done. Okay. The ability and willingness to assume risk is what entrepreneurial ability is. Now, I think it's chapter 16, I want to say. I don't know if I have to look at the chapter that deals with risk and risk management. And I think a lot of students find it to be very interesting. We also get into things like insurance and whatnot and why that exists. Talk about a service that you pay for up front and all that to manage risk. Risk management product. But what about this idea of risk? And I think that those who sort of promoted the idea of entrepreneur, I misspelled entrepreneur, there should be an N there. But I don't know what I mean. Entrepreneurial ability. See, I told you it was not an English major. So entrepreneurial ability, okay? I still misspelled. There's an E, there's an N-E there. All right, well, an N-E-U in there, isn't it? That's a long word anyway. Entrepreneur. All right, you get the idea. I think look it up in the book, right? So what is it? Why is this some X factor? Well, it's this idea. First of all, it's not to be a very commonly held trait that people want to take business risk. And so if you just think back to some of the entrepreneurs who, you know, are familiar household names to a lot of us, Bill Gates, right? Who was the co-founder of Microsoft. He leaves Harvard, arguably the best university on the planet, because he says, oh, they can't teach me anything anymore. And he starts a software company in an industry that really didn't exist, and sold a product to the biggest technology company on the planet, IBM, that didn't also exist. I mean, either that's crazy or just really gutsy or whatever. Leaves Harvard and goes to IBM saying, I've got a product, which he didn't even have at the time, but wanted the contract. And then said to them, we're not going to sell it to you, we're going to license the product. So we own the product, and everyone who uses it is going to just pay for it up front. We actually own the product because software is intellectual property. And at the time, IBM sort of bought it, and that's part of legendary ability. That's this idea of risk taking. One other one that I used for years, and I hope I'm not sort of dating myself and moving past your own experience, but Martha Stewart is an example of an entrepreneur. And Martha Stewart obviously started as a small catering business that grew into this company. I think it was called Martha Stewart Omnimedia or whatever. She had TV shows, cookbooks, you know, all kinds of stuff that was out there. And then she got sent to prison. And people say, why are you bringing Martha Stewart? What a terrible example. Well, not really, because what about risk? She took a big risk and got caught doing it and had to go to the slammer for a few months, right? Well, with big risks come big rewards, but also can come big downsides. And she took a big risk that didn't pay off. Now, she's out of prison, but I don't think she's ever really gained her. I think the only time I see her now is on cat box commercials. So she was a big deal.
Some small cooking show out there too. My girl
Oh, does she? Okay, yeah.
I'll come home sometimes and I eat all, I'm like, what is this?
We used to have Martha Stewart cookbooks all over the place, but that's an example of risk taking. You know, she had a great job on Wall Street, left that to start this rinky-dink catering company. That just grew and grew and grew and became what it became. That's an idea of risk taking is, and we're going to talk about this idea of who is risk seeking and who is risk averse. And most of us are risk averse. That is, it's not for us. It's not for me, really. I don't know if it is for you. This idea of taking crazy risks. Okay, so that's a good stopping point for where we are today. So we come back on Tuesday. I'll get into the difference between goods and services. That's a very quick discussion. We lost a day, so you know, we'll make it up. And then we'll get into some discussion of costs, which is the beginning of a long-running discussion on costs. And then we'll start our conversation on supply and demand. So everybody have a great weekend. See you next time. Just the readings.